Hey guys, it's Sarah with AmericanMuscle.com, and today we have a review and install of the Eibach Sportline lowering springs, fitting your 11 and newer V6 and V8 rear-wheel drive Chargers without the self-leveling suspension. These are for the Charger owner who's looking for a quality set of lowering springs to get them that aggressive stance while keeping their factory struts and shocks. These springs will get you that bold, lowered stance and improve your handling by lowering your center of gravity. They feature a progressive spring rate with high-strength steel construction and a red powder coat finish. This kit comes with 2 front springs that will lower the front of your car 1.7 inches, and 2 rear springs that will lower the rear of your car 1.8 inches. Both of these will clear your factory wheels and tires. So as far as price goes, these springs come in at around $300 for the set, which is middle of the road price-wise when compared to other options. And for your money, you are getting a quality set from a well-known suspension company like Eibach, and you're saving some money by retaining your factory struts and shocks. And as far as the install goes, I'm giving this one a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. It will require a spring compressor for the front struts, and you're required to trim your rear bump stops as well. All in all, it can be done within 4 hours, so with that said, let's check out the install. For this install, we used an impact gun, but a regular ratchet will work just fine. You'll also need 6, 10, 13, 15, 18, 21, and 24 millimeter wrenches, 13, 16, 15, 18, and 21 millimeter sockets. You'll also need a 6 millimeter Allen key or Allen socket, and you may also want a swivel extension or regular extension. You'll need a small pry bar or a flathead screwdriver, a trim panel removal tool, a bungee cord or similar tool to hang your knuckle, a hammer, a pry bar, a razor knife or similar cutting tool, and you may want a measuring tape. All right, so we have our Charger in the air. We have a lift here, but if you have a jack and jack stands, you can do it that way as well. Just make sure that your car is properly supported before you go underneath. Now the first step in our uninstall will be to grab a 21 millimeter socket and remove the nut on the sway bar end link. With your 21 millimeter socket, go ahead and remove that nut. Now, if for some reason the ball joint in this end link spins, what you can do is grab a 10 millimeter wrench and hold the end, and with a 21 millimeter ratcheting wrench, remove the nut. Either way, remove your end link from the back of your strut. And now going to the bottom of our strut assembly with an 18 millimeter socket and a 24 millimeter wrench, go ahead and remove the bolt on the bottom of your assembly. And now with a large pry bar, we're gonna slide it on top of our upper control arm. We're just gonna press down just to take some of the tension off of it. And with an 18 millimeter swivel socket, go ahead and remove the nut. Now I'm gonna leave this nut threaded on just a little bit because what we need to do is hit right about here to release the ball joint. With a hammer, go ahead and hit right here in order to release the ball joint out of our knuckle. And once you release that ball joint, go ahead and slide your pry bar back up top, put some tension on, and remove that knuckle. And now we don't want to just let the knuckle hang like that. It will put a little too much tension on our brake line. So what we're gonna do is grab a bungee cord, you can use some wire, anything that will just take a little bit of the tension off. Go ahead and wrap that around, and now there won't be any tension on your brake line. Now we're moving on to the engine bay. What we need to do is pop this cover off here to reveal the 3 nuts that hold on the top of our strut. So what we're gonna do is grab a trim panel removal tool, or you can use a flathead as well. Go ahead and go underneath and pop it up. Now with your 13 millimeter socket, we're gonna remove these 3 nuts. Now what I'm gonna do is thread this front one back on just a little bit to hold the strut in place so that it does not fall. And we will drop it down in a second. Now that we're back down, what I'm gonna do is disconnect this bungee cord just for a second and allow this to fall forward, enough so that I can lift up on the strut and clear the lower control arm. Now I'm gonna go ahead and reattach this bungee cord. Make sure we're not putting tension on the brake line, as I said before. And reach up to remove that nut up top. And then go ahead and remove the entire strut assembly off of your car. All right, so at this point, now that we have the strut assembly removed, we need to compress it in a spring compressor in order to remove the spring off of the assembly and replace it with your new one. Now, if you don't have a spring compressor or you don't feel comfortable operating one, you can take it to a shop and have them press it in for you. But either way, what we're going to do is compress the top of the strut assembly enough so that we take the pressure off the spring so that you can remove this top nut here. Go ahead and compress the spring down. Now with an 18mm socket, go ahead and release the nut that's on the top here. And again, make sure you're only doing so as long as the spring is properly compressed. And once the nut is removed, go ahead and remove the strut out of the bottom. Now what we're going to do is very, very carefully release the pressure on this spring. And we need to remove this top hat off of the spring itself. All right, so now that we have our factory spring uninstalled from our car, we can check it out side by side with our iBox spring here. Now, as you can see, the biggest visual difference is that nice red powder coat, which is gonna get you that aftermarket look that you're going for and is a nice upgrade from the black of your factory. Now, this spring features steel construction similar to factory, but the biggest functional difference is that this will get your car lower, 1.7 inches lower than factory. So with that said, we're gonna go ahead and finish up our install. And now we have the new front spring here, and you'll know it's for the front because it'll be marked with an F after the part number, and they are a little fatter than the rear springs. What we're gonna do is take our factory top hat, slide it into the spring, and then we're lining it up with that opening here on the rubber. Go ahead and press it into place and make sure it's all the way lined up. Now we can set this whole assembly back on the spring compressor. Now at this point you can go in reverse and compress that top hat back down on the spring. Now we're only gonna compress enough so that all of the threads from our strut come through the top. Grab your strut assembly, line it up through the bottom, and as long as you see all the threads coming through the top, go ahead and thread your nut back on. And with your 18mm socket, tighten it down. Now very carefully, begin to release your spring. And you wanna make sure the bottom of your strut is lined up with the proper formation of the studs. And if not, you can spin it so that it is lined up. Now, if it doesn't line up correctly, you can also line it up a little bit later once it's bolted on our car. All right, now at this point, we can get this strut assembly reinstalled on our car. Now, I did want to point out the shape of the top hat here. You'll see there's two studs towards the back and one towards the front. And that's exactly how it lines up on the car. Now, because of that, there's only one way for the bottom of this assembly to line up, and that is with this opening for your end link facing backwards. Now, if this is not how your strut looks, what you can do is install that top hat and you can move the bottom configuration with a pry bar. But for now, we're gonna get this installed. Go ahead and line up those 3 studs, 1 at the front, 2 in the back. And once you have it lined up, I'm going to throw a nut over top of one of the studs to hold it in place. Now you guys can see a little bit of what I was describing. The angle of the strut here is not quite the same angle as our lower control arm, and we will need this to line up. So if yours is like mine, what we're going to do is grab a small pry bar or a flathead screwdriver, and we're just gonna twist until we're lined up better. And now we can line it up over the top of the lower control arm. And now what we're gonna do is remove the bungee cord again, just so we can pull down slightly on our knuckle and get our strut assembly over top. Go ahead and replace that. All right, now what we're gonna do here is remove this bungee cord the rest of the way, because we're going to attach our upper control arm. Now at this point, what we're gonna do is attach the ball joint into the knuckle. So I'm prying down on our upper control arm, lining it up through the knuckle, beginning to thread on the nut. Now with our 18mm swivel socket, go ahead and tighten this down. Now if this ball joint is spinning instead of tightening down, what we're gonna do is grab an 18mm wrench. I'm using a ratcheting wrench, as well as a 6mm Allen key. Go ahead and tighten it down this way. That way you're holding the ball joint steady while you tighten it down. Now at this point, we can line up the strut with your lower control arm. You may have to move your knuckle assembly up and down in order to line that up. Thread your nut on the other side. And then with your 18mm socket and your 24mm wrench, tighten it down. And now you can reinstall your sway bar end link through the back of your strut. Replace the factory nut. And with a 21mm socket, go ahead and tighten it down. Now, if it spins like ours is spinning now, what we're gonna do is grab some wrenches so we can tighten it down by hand. Now with a 21mm ratcheting wrench and a 10mm wrench, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this down. The 10mm is holding this in place so that we can actually tighten the 21mm nut. And now we're back in the engine bay. We previously installed this nut just to hold our strut assembly in place. We're gonna install the other 2. And with our 13mm socket, tighten it down. And then you can go ahead and replace the cover that goes on top of your strut tower. All right, so now that this side is complete, repeat all of those steps to install your passenger side. Make sure everything is torqued to spec, and now we're gonna head to the rear to complete the rear install. All right, now that we're at the back of the car, we have our wheel off and we have the lower control arm supported with a pole jack. Now, if you're on the ground on jack stands, support it with a regular jack, but once you've done that, we're gonna remove the bolts at the bottom of our shock. Grab a 15mm socket, and we have an 18mm wrench on the nut on the other side, and go ahead and get this removed. Now, the second bolt that has to come out is towards the inside of your lower control arm, and it faces right against your exhaust. Now, in order to access this bolt better, what we're gonna do is drop down the exhaust a little bit so that we can get that bolt removed. First, we're gonna unplug the active exhaust and then remove both of the brackets. So we're gonna unplug the active exhaust on both sides, press down on the tab on top, and just pull back to release. All right, now we're at the back of the exhaust by the tip, and there is a 13mm bolt just above the tip, maybe a little bit hard to see. We're gonna get a 13mm socket with a swivel and extension. Go ahead and get this removed. And now we're moving a little bit farther back on the exhaust, right above the active portion. What we're gonna do is grab a 13mm socket or wrench, we have a ratcheting wrench here, and remove this bolt. Now, once that bolt is removed, we're gonna add a pull jack or just a regular jack to lift up slightly on the exhaust. And what that's gonna allow us to do is lift this bracket above this little tab there. Now, once the bracket is above the tab, just go ahead and drop it down. Make sure you repeat that on the other side as well. Now that we have our exhaust lowered down, I do have a pull jack supporting the exhaust at the front, and we have one supporting the back part of the control arm as well. Have an 18mm wrench. Now we can get on the head of this bolt with a 15mm socket. Go ahead and get it loose. All right, now this bolt may not want to come out easily, and if so, grab a open-ended wrench or another prying method and just put a little bit of pressure on it as you pull back, and then you can release it and get it out of this control arm. All right, with both of those bolts removed, what we can do now is slowly lower your pull jack or your floor jack in order to relieve pressure on that spring, and so we can remove it off of the car. All right, now that we have our rear spring uninstalled from our car, we can take a look at it side by side with our new spring here. Now, as you can see, the biggest visual difference, like I said before, is that nice bright red powder coat. It does feature steel construction, just like our factory spring. However, this one is gonna lower the back of your car approximately 1.8 inches. Now, one thing to note with the rear install that is different from the front is that we will be trimming the bump stop that lives inside our rear shock. So with that said, let's go ahead and check that out. All right, so as I said before, we need to remove our shock so that we can trim down the bump stop. To do that, we're gonna grab a 16mm socket and get out the two remaining bolts at the top. Now I have a 16mm socket here, and I also have a swivel, just makes it a little easier to get onto the bolt. Go ahead and get it removed. And repeat that for the other one. All right, now what we're gonna do next is wiggle our shock so it drops down. And then by pulling down with a pry bar or by hand, go ahead and wiggle it out and remove it off the car. All right, now that we have the shock off of our car, what we're gonna do is disassemble the top portion of it so that we can get to the bump stop so that we can trim it. First thing you're gonna do is grab a 15mm socket and remove the nut on top of your shock. Now, if this nut starts to spin, which it may, what we're gonna do is slide a wrench over top. We have a 15mm ratcheting wrench. And then I have a very small wrench, I think 6mm, but if you have any sort of adjustable, just to grab these two flat portions here and hold it in place. And then we're just gonna loosen this the rest of the way. Now you can spin the nut off. Remove this whole top portion. Be mindful of how it came off and what configuration. Slide the dust cover off, and now we can see our bump stop. Go ahead and slide that off as well so that we can trim it. All right, now we have the bump stop here. We're gonna measure at about 25 millimeters or 1 inch. So I'm gonna take this off right on the bottom of this ridge here. Now to do this, you may want to just mark where you'd like to cut. Again, I'm gonna use that ridge as a guideline, and I'm using a razor knife, but you can use a similar cutting tool. I'm just gonna cut along that line. And now we can get it reinstalled. Go ahead and reinstall the bump stop. Then your cover. Then the rest of this top bracket. Make sure that you have that washer on top there, because it does have a tendency to fall off. Thread on your nut. And with your 15 millimeter socket, tighten it down. All right, now that the shock is back together, what we're gonna do is put our pry bar back in there. Line up the shock in the lower control arm and pry down. Pry down as we line it up top. All right, now we can line up the top of the shock on the car. Reinstall the factory bolts. And with your 16 millimeter socket, tighten it down. All right, so before we install the new springs, we have the rubber boots on top and bottom, the isolators. We're gonna install them on top first. Now there's a little flap there. What we're gonna do is tuck the end of your spring into that. Make sure it's seated all the way up against the edge and just press it in place. Now for the bottom one, same thing. What you're gonna do is slide the spring, twist it in place, and you'll see it butt up right against the edge there. Now you'll see a tab on the bottom rubber isolator. That lines up with an opening in the lower control arm, sort of faces inward towards the center of the car. Make sure that is lined up. And then go ahead and line up the spring. Make sure the upper isolator is in line with where it sits on the body. All right, now that we have our spring properly seated in both the rubber isolators, we have our pole jack under here to jack up. If you're on the ground, you'll be using your floor jack now. But go ahead and jack up on the lower control arm and guide it up past your subframe. Once it's lined up, go ahead and slide your bolt in. All right, now with that back control arm bolt in, what we're gonna do is install the bolt in the front of the control arm in the bottom of our shock. Make sure you install the nuts on the back sides of these, but we are not gonna tighten these down until the car is on the ground. All right, so now that we have both of those bolts back in the lower control arm, we're gonna compress the suspension so that we can tighten them down. Now you don't want to tighten these bolts down with your suspension at full droop, so you can either jack up on the lower control arm like we're doing here, or if you are on the ground, you can put the wheels back on and put the car on its own weight. We're just doing this to give you guys a better look at those bolts as we tighten them down. So we're going to go ahead and raise this jack so we can compress our suspension. And now that our suspension is compressed, grab a 15mm socket and an 18mm wrench and tighten it down. And repeat that for your lower shock mount bolt. 15mm socket and an 18mm wrench, tighten it down. All right, now that we have this side fully installed and tightened down, you're gonna repeat that process on the other side. Once that side is fully installed, we can reinstall the exhaust. All right, now we have our pole jack, or you can use a regular floor jack underneath our exhaust right near the active section. And what we're doing is we're just pushing up until this bracket clears that tab. And once it is clear, we can grab the factory bolt and go ahead and reinstall it. And with your 13mm socket or ratcheting wrench, go ahead and tighten it down. And don't forget to plug back in your active exhaust. Now moving on to the back of the exhaust, make sure you reinstall the bolt at the back as well. And with your 13mm socket, tighten it down. Now make sure you reinstall the passenger side of your exhaust and that everything is torqued to spec. You will want a professional alignment afterwards, but that is going to do it for the review and install of these lowering springs. And remember, for all things Charger, keep it at AmericanMuscle.com.